Samarkand, Central Asia, June 1941. The air in the mausoleum is old. It smells of stone and dust and something else. Something you can't quite name. Maybe it's just the weight of 500 years pressing down on the cool, dark room. Or maybe it's something else entirely. A team of Soviet scientists, men with notebooks and measuring tools and electric torches, crowd around a large stone coffin in the center of the floor. The coffin is made of dark nephrite jade, green and heavy, and it hasn't been touched in over 5 centuries. Outside, the summer sun bakes the ancient streets of Samarkand. Inside, it is cold. The lead scientist is a man named Mikhail Gerasimov. He is young, curious, excited. He has been waiting for this moment for months. This tomb, called the Gure Amir, meaning Tomb of the Ruler, holds the remains of the most feared conqueror the medieval world ever produced. Opening it could answer questions historians have argued about for 500 years. But 3 old men are blocking the door. They are elders of the city. They are not shouting. They are not angry. They are calm, which somehow makes it worse. They carry an ancient manuscript, its pages yellow and crumbling, and they say the same thing, quietly, again and again. Do not open this tomb. There is a warning. If you disturb what rests here, something terrible will be unleashed upon the world. Something worse than anything this man ever caused in life. The scientists look at each other. It's 1941. They are men of science. They don't believe in curses. They open the tomb anyway. 3 days later, the largest military invasion in the history of the human race began. Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. 3 million soldiers crossing the Soviet border, all at once. And the Soviet Union, the nation these scientists worked for, was suddenly fighting for its very survival. By the time it was over, between 25 and 27 million Soviet people would be dead. Now, historians will tell you that the timing was a coincidence, and they are probably right. But probably isn't the same as certainly. And in a tomb in Samarkand, on the inner lid of that ancient green coffin, they found words carved into the stone. Whosoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I. So who was buried in that tomb? What kind of man could frighten people for 500 years after his death? And why, even now in the 21st century, does the world still argue about whether he was a hero or a monster? Hold on, because to answer those questions, we need to go back, way, way back, to a broken world, a wounded boy, and a name that means iron. Okay, before we get to our guy, we need to understand the world he was born into. Because this world, shattered, dangerous, and glittering all at once, is what made him possible. About 100 years before Timur was born, a Mongolian warlord named Temujin united dozens of warring steppe tribes into a single unstoppable machine of conquest. You know this man. History calls him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. And between roughly 1206 and his death in 1227, he and his armies did something that had never happened before in human history. They conquered more territory in less time than any empire ever had. Think about that for a second. From the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Eastern Europe, an area that covered more than 9 million square miles, almost the entire continent of Asia, plus chunks of Europe. At its peak, the Mongol Empire covered about 24% of the Earth's total land surface. If it existed today, it would cover the United States, China, Canada, Brazil, Australia, and India, combined. Now, after Genghis died, his enormous empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, and like most things divided among competitive relatives, it started falling apart almost immediately. By the time Timur was born, in the 1330s, the great Mongol Empire had cracked into 4 main pieces, called Khanates. Think of a Khanate as a kingdom ruled by a Khan, which just means ruler or lord in the Mongol and Turkic languages. In the east, the Yuan dynasty ruling China and Mongolia. In the west, the Golden Horde ruling Russia and Eastern Europe. In the southwest, the Ilkhanate ruling Persia and much of the Middle East. And right in the middle of Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate. This is where our story lives. The Chagatai Khanate, named after one of Genghis Khan's sons, controlled a vast region that today includes the countries of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and parts of Afghanistan and China. But by the 1340s, even the Chagatai Khanate had split in 2. In the east, a wild, mostly nomadic region called Mogolistan, still ruled by Chinggisid Khans, meaning actual descendants of Genghis Khan, whose people lived on horseback and in tents, following their herds across the open steppe. In the west, a settled, civilized, largely Muslim region called Transoxiana. Transoxiana. It means the land beyond the river, specifically the Amu Darya River, one of the great rivers of Central Asia, and this land was something special. Imagine a region of legendary cities, Samarkand, which sat on the ancient Silk Road and gleamed with blue-tiled mosques and busy bazaars. Bukhara, one of the greatest centers of Islamic learning in the medieval world. Kesh, a smaller city, a regional town by comparison, but still part of this extraordinary network of civilization strung like jewels across the desert. The Silk Road, by the way, was the ancient network of trade routes connecting China, India, Persia, the Arab world, and eventually Europe. For centuries, caravans loaded with silk, spices, glassware, precious stones, and ideas traveled these roads. The cities of Transoxiana sat right in the middle of that flow of goods and knowledge, getting rich and sophisticated from the traffic. But by the 1340s and 1350s, Transoxiana had no real ruler. The Chagatai Khans couldn't keep control. Local lords called amirs, the word just means commanders or princes, fought each other constantly. Armies from the eastern Mongols swept in and out, raiding and looting. The cities suffered. Trade suffered. The people suffered. Into this broken, beautiful, dangerous world, this land of Silk Road cities and warring warlords, of blue domes and burning villages, of incredible wealth and endless chaos, a boy was born around 1336. His name was Timur. It means iron. And out of this chaos, he was about to reshape half the known world. Before he was a conqueror, he was a thief. Before he was feared by kings, he was just a limping young man with 2 arrows' worth of pain in his body and a head full of ambition that didn't match his circumstances at all. Timur was born near the city of Kesh, a town now called Shahrisabz, in what is today the nation of Uzbekistan, in the south of Central Asia. His father, a man named Taragai, was a minor lord of the Barlas tribe, a Turkic Mongol people. Not royalty, not a great Chinggisid dynasty, just minor nobility. Respectable, but not powerful. The Barlas tribe was interesting, though. They were originally Mongolian. Their ancestors had ridden with Genghis Khan's armies 2 generations back, but they had been living among Turkic-speaking, Persian-cultured Muslim people for so long that they had largely become those things. They spoke Turkic, they practiced Islam, they lived in and around cities, unlike the nomadic Mongols of the East. This mixture, Mongol roots, Turkic tongue, Persian culture, Muslim faith, is important. Timur grew up straddling 2 worlds, the nomadic warrior world of the steppe, where toughness and horsemanship were everything, and the settled, educated world of the city, where art, literature, architecture, and trade ruled. He would spend his entire life using both. Timur was multilingual. He could reportedly converse in Turkic, Persian, and Mongolian. He loved playing chess, and was so skilled at it that a more complex variant of the game, played on a 10x10 board with additional pieces, is believed to have been developed specifically to challenge him. It's called Tamerlane chess, and people still play it today. Now, here is where the story gets a little murky, and I want to be honest with you about that. Because one of the most important things you can learn about history is this. The sources that tell us about Timur's early life were written years, sometimes decades, after the events they describe. And they were written by people with very different agendas. Some were written by Timur's own court, people who wanted to make him look wonderful. Others were written by his enemies, people who had every reason to make him look terrible. The truth about Timur's early life lies somewhere between the flattery and the fury. Here's what we can piece together. As a young man, probably in his teens and early 20s, Timur was a small-time raider in a lawless borderland. Transoxiana in the 1350s was a place where survival sometimes meant taking what you could find, where you could find it. Bands of men operated on the edges of power, stealing livestock, raiding caravans, selling their swords to whoever would pay. One night, exactly when is unclear, a raid went badly wrong. Timur was struck by 2 arrows, one in his right leg, one in his right hand. The leg wound was serious. It never fully healed. For the rest of his life, Timur walked with a pronounced limp. His right hand lost function in 2 fingers. His enemies, and he would eventually have many of them, turned these injuries into a nickname. In Persian, they called him Timuri Lang, Timur the Lame. The word Lang means lame or crippled. And as word of this man spread west into the Arabic world, into Turkey, and eventually across the Mediterranean into Europe, the name got twisted further. Timuri Lang became Tamerlane, or Tamerlane, or Tamerlane, depending on where you were. Here's the thing about that nickname, though. His enemies meant it as an insult, a mockery. Look, the great conqueror walks with a limp. He's just a lame thief. But history has a way of flipping insults into legends. Today, 5 centuries later, Tamerlane is one of the most recognized names in world history. The insult became the legend. The lame man became the most feared conqueror of the medieval world. But in the 1350s and 1360s, Tamerlane was still just a young man in a broken land, trying to figure out how to survive. And survival, it turned out, would require him to make some very difficult choices, including one that would make a friend into an enemy, and an enemy into a path to power. In Transoxiana in the 1360s, everyone had an army, and nobody had a kingdom. The man who could change that would own everything, but first, he'd have to betray everything. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1360s. Timur is in his mid to late 20s. Transoxiana is a mess. The eastern Mongols, the Chagatai rulers of Mogolistan, keep sweeping in from the east, raiding cities, demanding tribute, and generally making everyone miserable. Local amirs fight each other. Alliances form, break, reform. Loyalties shift like desert sand in the wind. Into this chaos, Timur formed a partnership that would define the next decade of his life. His name was Amir Hussein. He was Timur's brother-in-law, married to Timur's sister, and he was ambitious, capable, and well-connected. Together, they were quite a team. They fought off Mongol invasions from the east. They survived military disasters and came back fighting. There were periods, and this is mentioned in the chronicles, with some wonder, where their combined forces were reduced to just a handful of men, raiding for food, hiding in the hills, more outlaws than commanders. Imagine it, Timur and Hussein, 2 young men on horseback, riding through the steppe with almost nothing, hunted by enemies, surviving on what they could steal or trade. At their lowest point, they had fewer than a dozen followers between them, and still they didn't give up. By 1365, they had done something remarkable. Together, they drove the eastern Mongol invaders, under a leader named Ilyas Khoja, out of Transoxiana. The cities breathed again. The Silk Road traders returned to their routes. But now came the harder problem. With the external enemy gone, the 2 allies started to notice their differences. Hussein moved his court to Balkh, a city in what is now northern Afghanistan, outside of Transoxiana itself, which annoyed the local lords. He was seen as distant, self-interested, and increasingly greedy. He taxed the lords heavily. He kept the spoils of war rather than sharing them. In a tribal society where generosity was not just a virtue, but a political necessity, you rewarded your followers, or your followers found someone else to follow. Hussein was making a fatal mistake. Timur, by contrast, was conspicuously generous. He shared plunder. He listened to the local amirs. He cultivated relationships. He made people feel seen and valued. It's worth noticing something here. Timur was not just a warrior. He was a politician, a diplomat, a man who understood that power isn't just about having the biggest army. It's about making people want to follow you. The tension between Timur and Hussein grew. It became open hostility, and in 1370, Timur moved against his former partner. He besieged Hussein's stronghold at Balkh. Hussein surrendered, and shortly after, the chronicles are vague on exactly how, Hussein was killed. Some accounts say he was executed. Some say a follower of Timur's killed him without direct orders. Either way, Timur was now the undisputed master of Transoxiana. He was 34 years old. He had started with almost nothing. He had fought through a decade of near constant danger, betrayal, and hardship, and now he stood at the top of a broken land, holding power that no one else could challenge. But here's where it gets interesting, because Timur had a problem that no army could solve. He ruled everything. He commanded everyone. He was the most powerful man in Central Asia, and yet there was one title, just 4 letters, that he could never claim, and that impossibility changed everything. Timur could not be Khan. That's it. That's the problem. Khan, remember, that word means ruler, the supreme leader of a Mongol state, was not just a title you grabbed because you were powerful enough. In the Mongol and Turkic world, being Khan required one thing above all: blood. You had to be descended from Genghis Khan himself, from his actual bloodline, the line they called Chinggisid. And Timur, for all his brilliance, all his victories, all his ambitions, was not. He was from the Barlas tribe, yes, which had Mongol roots, but not the right Mongol roots, not the imperial clan. Think about what this means for a moment. Imagine you worked harder than anyone else in your school. You studied more, trained more, earned more, and you became the actual leader of everything. You ran the whole show. But there's this one ancient rule that says the title of principal can only go to someone with a specific last name, and yours isn't it. You have all the power, you just can't have the title. What would you do? Timur found a solution that was genuinely clever, a political workaround that let him hold all the power while technically following the rules. First, he found a Chinggisid prince, a real descendant of Genghis Khan, and put him on the throne as a puppet Khan. The prince got the fancy title. Timur got to make every actual decision. The puppet Khan was essentially a rubber stamp. He sat in the throne, looked important, and did whatever Timur said. Second, Timur married a woman named Saray Mulk Khanum. She was a widow of his former rival Husayn, and more importantly, she was a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. By marrying her, Timur gained the right to use a title, Guragen. It means son-in-law of the royal house. So his official title was not king, not Khan, not emperor. It was Amir, commander, and Guragen, son-in-law of the Chinggisid line. The Mughal emperors of India, who were Timur's direct descendants, also used the title Guragen to emphasize their connection to Genghis Khan's lineage. This connection to Chinggis was so important to them that they used it for 200 years after Timur's death. He also claimed something else, that he was a divinely ordained protector of both the Mongol world and the Islamic faith. Whether he truly believed this, or whether it was political messaging, probably a bit of both, it gave him a kind of moral authority that went beyond mere military force. Here's the fascinating thing about this situation. The most powerful man in Central Asia, a man who would go on to defeat the rulers of Persia, India, the Golden Horde, and the Ottoman Empire, spent his entire life officially calling himself a commander and a son-in-law. The real power and the title of power were two completely different things. Does that seem strange to you? It is, but it also happens more than you might think, even in the modern world. The person with the official title and the person who actually runs things aren't always the same. Timur understood this perfectly. He didn't need to be called Khan. He needed to be Khan. And the difference between those two things, needing the title and needing the power, is one of the most interesting things about him. But now that he had the power, it was time to use it. And he had something very specific in mind for Samarkand. Every conqueror he ever defeated, every city he ever took, Timur gave them the same ultimatum: send me your best, your artists, your architects, your scholars, your craftsmen. And they came, willing or not. They came, and from their work, the most dazzling city in the medieval world rose out of the dust of the Silk Road. Close your eyes for a moment. Actually, don't, because you're watching a video. But imagine you are standing at the edge of Samarkand in the late 1380s. You are a traveler who has walked 3 weeks across the desert from the west, and you are tired and dusty, and your sandals are worn through at the heel. And then you see it. A city of maybe 150,000 people, one of the largest cities in the world at the time. A city surrounded by gardens, actual gardens, in the middle of Central Asia's semi-arid landscape, watered by a sophisticated network of irrigation canals. Orchards of apricots and mulberries and pomegranates, heavy with fruit, their branches shading the roads. The smell of bread baking, of roasting meat, of horse leather and rose water, and the distant coolness of fountains. And above the gardens, the skyline. Domes. Enormous domes, covered in glazed tiles of cobalt blue and turquoise and gold, catching the sunlight and throwing it back like they've swallowed a star. Minarets, tall, slender towers from which the call to prayer rings out 5 times a day, reaching so high they seem to scratch the sky. Arched gateways covered in intricate geometric patterns, so precise and beautiful that you don't understand how human hands made them. This is Samarkand, Timur's capital, Timur's obsession, Timur's greatest project. After Timur took power in 1370, he made Samarkand his capital and began transforming it. And the way he transformed it tells you something essential about who he was, because the building of Samarkand happened at the same time as the conquests that devastated other cities. Every time Timur conquered a new place, he did something specific. He identified the most talented people there: architects, artisans, stonecutters, tile workers, painters, astronomers, poets, theologians, and sent them to Samarkand. Not as prisoners exactly, though they didn't really have a choice, more like conscripted geniuses. They worked, they were paid, they were sometimes given houses and patronage, and their work rose, stone by stone and tile by tile, into the skyline we're imagining. From Persia, master architects and tile workers who knew how to build those breathtaking blue domes. From the Caucasus, stonemasons and craftsmen. From India, artisans who worked in wood and precious metals. From Syria, scholars and physicians and poets. From everywhere Timur went, something beautiful brought home. The Bibi Khanim Mosque, commissioned by Timur in honor of his beloved wife after his invasion of India, built by artisans from across 3 continents, so large that its central dome was one of the biggest in the world at the time it was built. The Gur-e Amir, the mausoleum where Timur would eventually be buried, its ribbed, melon-shaped dome covered in geometric patterns, visible from miles away, still standing today. The Registan, which means sandy place, a central plaza surrounded by 3 magnificent madrasas or schools, their facades glittering with tile work. The turquoise tiles on Samarkand's domes were made using a technique called cut tile mosaic. Each tiny piece of colored tile cut precisely and fitted together like a jigsaw puzzle into complex geometric patterns. A single large dome might require millions of individual pieces. The craftsmen who did this work were considered master artists and were paid accordingly. Now, and this is the tension we need to sit with throughout this whole story, those craftsmen building those beautiful buildings? Many of them were there because their home cities had been conquered, looted, and sometimes devastated by the same man who was now paying them to create beauty. Think about that. Timur the destroyer and Timur the builder are not 2 different people. They are the same person, and Samarkand is the evidence. But while Samarkand was rising, an old friend, a man who owed Timur everything, a man Timur had personally rescued and placed on a throne, was turning into Timur's most dangerous enemy, and that betrayal would set off a war that would change the map of the world. He was a fugitive. He had nothing. Timur sheltered him, fed him, armed him, and helped him take a throne. And then Toktamish looked his benefactor in the eye and declared war, twice. In the mid-1370s, a desperate young prince arrived at Timur's court with almost nothing. His name was Toktamish. He was a Chinggisid prince, a real descendant of Genghis Khan, who had been fighting a losing battle for control of the White Horde, a division of the Golden Horde kingdom that controlled the steppes north and east of the Caspian Sea. He had lost. He was running for his life. Timur took him in. This was partly generosity, partly strategy. A Chinggisid prince as an ally, someone you'd help to power, who owed you everything, was a valuable political asset, and Timur genuinely seems to have liked Toktamish. He sheltered him, he gave him troops, he supported him not once but twice in campaigns to seize control of his territory. By 1378, Toktamish was Khan of the White Horde. By 1380, he had unified the entire Golden Horde under his control, becoming one of the most powerful rulers in the world, commanding a vast empire across the steppes of Russia, from the Black Sea to Siberia. It was in large part Timur's doing. And then Toktamish made a decision that would define both their lives. He decided that the Caucasus region, the mountains and valleys between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, where modern-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan are, belonged to the Golden Horde. Timur's armies were operating in that region. Toktamish sent diplomatic protests. Timur ignored them. And in 1385, while Timur was campaigning in Persia, Toktamish launched his first attack, striking south and west, taking cities, raiding deep into territory Timur considered his. The betrayal stung Timur in a way few things could. This wasn't just a military challenge. This was the man he had rescued. the man who would be nobody without him, biting the hand that had fed him. Timur prepared his response carefully. He spent months gathering intelligence, assembling supplies, planning logistics, and in January 1391, in the middle of winter, when no one expected a major campaign to begin, he set out north. The Battle of the Kondurcha River, June 18, 1391. Toktamish had anticipated that Timur would cross the Ural River at a specific ford. He gathered his forces there, but Timur, as he always did, had anticipated his enemy's anticipation. He crossed further upriver, forcing Toktamish to scramble and retreat, and the two armies finally met at the Kondurcha River in June. Both sides brought enormous forces, both arrayed in great crescent formations, the classic Mongolian battle formation, like two curved arms, trying to reach around and embrace the enemy's flanks. The battle was fierce. Toktamish attacked first across the whole front, leading charges himself. For a while, things looked difficult for Timur. Parts of his line buckled, flanks were threatened. But then some of Toktamish's flank commanders retreated, whether from treachery, miscommunication, or simple bad luck, and suddenly the Golden Horde's lines thinned. Timur spotted the weakness instantly and ordered a massive countercharge. The Horde's left and center broke, the rest retreated. Timur had won, but Toktamish and much of his army had escaped. Victory without conclusion, like winning 3 battles in a game that has 4. Timur declared a new Khan of the Golden Horde, a puppet to replace his ungrateful protege, and went home. But Toktamish, resilient and stubborn, refused to accept defeat. He spent the next 4 years rebuilding his forces and reaching out to Timur's other enemies, the Ottomans, the Mamluks, trying to build an anti-Timur coalition. Timur could not allow that. The Battle of the Terek River, April 15-16, 1395. The second confrontation was more dramatic and more decisive than the first. This time, the armies met near the Terek River in the Caucasus. Toktamish controlled the north bank of the river at the main ford. Timur, unwilling to storm a defended river crossing, did something unexpected. He marched upstream with his entire army, as if searching for another crossing point. Toktamish mirrored him on the other bank, day after day, matching every move. On the third night, Timur's servants and women dressed in soldiers' armor and continued marching upstream, while the main army quietly doubled back in the darkness, crossed the now unguarded ford, and deployed on Toktamish's side of the river before dawn. By the time Toktamish realized the trick, it was too late. 2 days of fighting. The first day went badly for Timur. His left wing was lured into a feigned retreat, a classic steppe tactic, pretending to flee to draw the enemy out of formation, and then surrounded. Timur himself was nearly captured. His commanders improvised a barricade of wagons and fought through the night. But Timur didn't panic. He reorganized, and that night he made a move that wasn't military at all. He found out that one of Toktamish's most important commanders, a man named Aktau, was discontented with his leader. Timur sent him promises of reward. By morning, Aktau had abandoned the battlefield. Day 2. Toktamish's left flank, weakened by Aktau's desertion, collapsed under Timur's assault. The horde broke. Toktamish fled north, into the steppe, and never came back to threaten Timur again. What followed was methodical and devastating. Timur swept through the Golden Horde's territory, systematically destroying its economic foundations. Hajj Tarkan, Sarai, the Golden Horde's capital, one of the great cities of the medieval world, Azak, Tana, city after city, trading hub after trading hub, leveled. The Golden Horde never truly recovered. The great overland trade routes through its territory, which had been a cornerstone of the Silk Road since Genghis Khan's time, were permanently broken. The economic map of Eurasia shifted. Trade moved south and west. The cities of the Horde faded. Toktamish lived on for years, a wandering exile, eventually dying in the early 1400s, still trying to reclaim what he had lost. But while Timur was dealing with Toktamish in the north, things were happening to the south and west that required his attention. Things that would reveal the most terrible and most complicated side of the man who built Samarkand. Because Timur had a policy. Cities that surrendered peacefully were spared and often treated well. Cities that resisted and then revolted, those faced something different. Something that people still talk about in horror today. Let's talk about the darkest part of this story. And I want to be clear from the start. What I'm going to describe is not exciting. It is not cool. It is part of the historical record, and you deserve to know it honestly. But I also want to help you think about it like a historian, which means asking questions about sources, about exaggeration, about what we actually know and what has been inflated over time. Here is the policy Timur followed throughout his campaigns, documented consistently in the chronicles. Cities and regions that surrendered without significant resistance were typically treated with a degree of care. He would install his own administrators, take tribute, and move on. He allowed local cultures, religions, and customs to continue. He protected scholars and artisans specifically. Cities that resisted and then surrendered were dealt with more harshly. Their rulers were often executed or displaced. Significant tribute was extracted. But cities that surrendered then revolted against his authority, killed his administrators, attacked his garrisons, broke their word of surrender. Those faced what Timur called exemplary punishment. And those punishments were severe, very severe.
Isfahan, 1387.
Isfahan was one of the great cities of Persia. Today it is still one of the most beautiful cities in Iran, famous for its blue-tiled mosques and grand central square. In 1387, when Timur's armies arrived, the city's leaders chose to surrender. Timur accepted the surrender, moved on, and left a small garrison and some tax collectors behind. Then the people of Isfahan revolted. They killed his tax collectors. They attacked his garrison. Timur came back. The chronicles say that what followed was one of the worst massacres of his campaigns. According to the accounts, and remember, these accounts were written by people with strong reasons to either exaggerate or minimize, a massive number of people were killed. The numbers given range from 70,000 to 200,000, depending on the source. Historians today generally believe the real figure, whatever it was significant, but almost certainly lower than the most dramatic claims. And the skulls, this is the part that became most famous and most feared, were built into towers. Dozens of towers outside the city walls, each containing hundreds or thousands of skulls, as a visible warning to every traveler, every city, every lord who might be thinking about resistance. Now, let's think about this like a historian. The accounts of these towers, their height, the number of skulls, the specific places, were written by chroniclers who were often reporting from rumors and second-hand accounts, sometimes decades after the events. Timur's own court historians had an incentive to exaggerate the terror to deter rebellions before they started. His enemies had an incentive to make him sound as monstrous as possible. Historians debate the actual death tolls from Timur's campaigns to this day. Some estimates place the total across all his campaigns at 15 to 17 million deaths. Others think this is too high. The truth is, we don't know precisely, but we do know that the fear was real. The cities that chose to surrender rather than resist Timur often did so specifically because of what they had heard happen to the ones that didn't. That deterrence was a deliberate strategy. Here's the difficult thing I want you to sit with. The same man who ordered the Towers of Skulls also on that very same campaign through Persia made careful lists of every scholar, physician, architect, and artist in every city he captured, and arranged for them to be transported safely to Samarkand, where they were given workshops, salaries, and patronage. He wasn't separating his violence from his culture building. They were part of the same plan. The Islamic legal tradition recognized a distinction between cities that surrendered peacefully and cities that revolted after surrender. Timur used this legal framework to justify his punishments, arguing that a city that broke its word of surrender had forfeited its protections. This doesn't excuse what happened, but it shows that Timur was operating within a system of rules and justifications, not simply killing for pleasure. As terrible as the campaigns in Persia were, the world was about to watch Timur do something even more audacious, something even Genghis Khan had never fully achieved. He was going to march on India, crossing the Indus River, penetrating the subcontinent all the way to the gates of Delhi, and he was going to do it with war elephants blocking his way. The year was 1398. The city of Delhi had stood for centuries. The Delhi Sultanate had armies, walls, and something Timur's soldiers had never faced in battle. Trained war elephants, armored in mail and leather, with swords strapped to their tusks. Let's be honest, even for Timur, invading India was ambitious. The Delhi Sultanate was one of the wealthiest states in the medieval world, controlling the Indo-Gangetic Plain, the great fertile river valley at the heart of the Indian subcontinent, with its vast population, rich agriculture, and legendary cities. Delhi itself was enormous, one of the largest cities on earth at the time. The mountains and passes of Afghanistan and the Hindu Kush stood between Timur and India like a wall. The Indus River, wide, brown, fast-moving, presented a major obstacle, and the Delhi Sultanate's army included something Timur's soldiers had barely encountered before: war elephants. War elephants were exactly what they sound like. Massive Indian elephants. The males can weigh more than 5 tons, trained for battle, armored in thick leather and chain mail, with swords or blades strapped to their tusks, and soldiers riding in towers called howdahs on their backs. A charge of armored war elephants was one of the most terrifying things a medieval army could face. The noise alone, the trumpeting, the pounding feet, the ground shaking could break soldiers' nerve before a single blow was struck. Timur's army crossed the Indus in September 1398. He moved with characteristic speed, defeating smaller forces and capturing towns as he pushed toward Delhi. His advance guard, under his grandson Muhammad Sultan, was cautioned to take prisoners. Timur wanted intelligence about the Sultanate's defenses. But there was a problem, and it was a serious one. Timur's army had tens of thousands of prisoners from the march, civilians, soldiers from defeated garrisons, and they were a logistical burden. When Timur learned that the Sultan of Delhi was assembling his full army, including the elephants, his commanders made a brutal decision. The prisoners were a liability that could not be managed during a major battle. The chronicles say Timur ordered them killed. This is recorded in his own court chronicles as well as hostile sources. It is one of the darkest moments in a campaign full of dark moments. The Battle of Delhi, December 17, 1398. Nasir-ud-Din Mahmud Shah Tughlaq, Sultan of Delhi, deployed his army outside the city, including between 100 and 120 war elephants, armored and ready. Timur's solution was characteristically imaginative. He had observed, perhaps from his intelligence, perhaps from his own knowledge of animal behavior, that elephants were frightened by fire and by strange smells. He loaded his camels, thousands of them, with bundles of dry hay and wood. Just before the battle, at the right moment, the hay was set alight. The camels, panicking and burning, stamped it directly toward the elephant line. The elephants saw burning animals charging at them and did what even the best trained elephants sometimes did. They turned around. A line of panicking 5-ton animals charging backward through their own infantry is about as catastrophic as it sounds. The Delhi Sultanate's formation collapsed. Timur's cavalry swept through the chaos. The battle was over quickly. The Sultan fled. Delhi fell. The sack of Delhi that followed was devastating. The city took decades to recover. Some historians say a full century passed before it regained its former population and wealth. This was one of the most consequential destructions of the medieval period. But here's the detail that somehow captures Timur's contradictions perfectly. Before leaving India, Timur took something home with him. Not just gold and jewels and silk, though there was plenty of that. He took the master craftsman he needed for his greatest building project, the Bibi Khanim Mosque in Samarkand. And to help with the construction, he took the war elephants. Captured Indian war elephants were marched thousands of miles from Delhi, through Afghanistan, across the mountains of Central Asia, all the way to Samarkand, a journey of several months, where they were used to haul massive stone blocks for the construction of the Bibi Khanim Mosque. You can still visit this mosque today. Indian elephants hauling stone in the heart of Central Asia, building a mosque. If that image doesn't capture the sheer bewildering scale of Timur's world, I'm not sure what does. Timur returned to Samarkand from India, loaded with the wealth of a civilization. But the West was calling again. The cities of Syria and Iraq needed his attention, and in Damascus, a remarkable man was lowered over a city wall in a basket to have a conversation that would survive the centuries. A conversation about history itself. Ibn Khaldun was one of the greatest historians in the history of the world. He had written about the rise and fall of civilizations. He had seen rulers come and go, and now at 70 years old, he was being lowered over the walls of a besieged city in a basket to meet the man who was about to destroy everything he knew. Let's talk about a man named Ibn Khaldun. Born in Tunis in 1332, just a few years before Timur, he was an Arab scholar and historian of Berber descent who had lived across the Islamic world, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and now Damascus. He had served as a diplomat, a judge, an academic. He had written an extraordinary work called the Muqaddimah, a history of the world and a theory of how civilizations rise and fall. It is considered one of the founding works of sociology and historiography, the study of how history itself is written. In other words, Ibn Khaldun was a man whose whole life had been devoted to understanding power. And in the winter of 1400 to 1401, power came to Damascus in the form of Timur's army. The city of Damascus, the ancient capital of the old Umayyad Caliphate, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, was surrounded. Timur's forces had swept through Syria after capturing Aleppo, and now Damascus stood before him. Ibn Khaldun was in Damascus at the time, part of a delegation of scholars and officials. The city's governor was trying to negotiate, and Ibn Khaldun, 70 years old, the man who had spent his life studying conquerors, decided he needed to see this one for himself. He requested an audience with Timur. He was lowered from the city walls in a basket. The gates were not opened, apparently for fear of the army outside, and brought into the conqueror's camp. Imagine you are Ibn Khaldun. You are old. Your bones ache from the descent in the basket. Your robe is dusty. Around you, Timur's camp spreads for miles. Thousands of tents, tens of thousands of soldiers, horses, camels, artillery, the organized chaos of an army at the height of its power. Fires burn. Horses stamp. The smell of smoke and leather and livestock is everywhere. And then you are brought into the presence of Timur himself. He is seated on cushions, surrounded by advisors. He is not tall. Contemporary accounts suggest he was of medium height. He walks with a limp, using a staff. His eyes, the chronicles say, are deep-set and bright. He is in his mid-60s at this point, but his mind is sharp as a blade. He looks at you, and then he starts asking questions. The encounter between Ibn Khaldun and Timur is documented in Ibn Khaldun's own autobiography, one of the most vivid, first-hand accounts of Timur we have. According to this account, Timur was intensely curious. He asked detailed questions about the geography of North Africa, about Egypt, about the Maghreb, about the rulers there, about the roots and resources of the Western Islamic world. But the conversation went deeper than geography. Timur reportedly asked about the nature of power and civilization, the very subjects Ibn Khaldun had spent his life studying. The greatest scholar of civilization and the greatest conqueror of the age, sitting across from each other, having what sounds like a genuinely extraordinary conversation. Ibn Khaldun was, by his own account, deeply impressed by Timur's intelligence. Not by his power, he'd seen powerful men before, but by his mind, the breadth of his curiosity, the precision of his questions, the speed with which he absorbed information. Remember, Timur was, by most accounts, illiterate. He could not read or write, but he had an exceptional memory and had educated himself through listening. He had scholars read to him. He attended theological and philosophical debates. He played chess at a grandmaster level. Ibn Khaldun wrote that during their conversations, Timur expressed great familiarity with the great historical empires of the past, the Persians, the Greeks, the Arabs, the Mongols, and that he seemed to have thought deeply about why empires fell. This is particularly remarkable because Timur was, in effect, creating one of those empires that later historians would study for its own rise and fall. Damascus surrendered after the negotiations, but the city was still sacked, burned, and looted by soldiers Timur could not or did not fully control. The ancient Umayyad mosque was damaged by fire. Thousands of people were enslaved or killed. The artisans and craftsmen, as always, were identified and sent to Samarkand. Ibn Khaldun left Damascus shaken. He had met the man. He had been impressed by his intelligence. He had also watched him destroy one of the great cities of the Islamic world. Both things were true, simultaneously, uncomplicatedly true. From Damascus, Timur turned north and west toward the one power in the region that still rivaled his own. A man called Thunderbolt, Sultan Bayezid I of the Ottoman Empire, one of the most formidable rulers in the world. And what happened when these two empires crashed into each other outside the city of Ankara would echo through history for centuries. Bayezid I of the Ottoman Empire was called Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, because his armies moved so fast and struck so hard. He had crushed the armies of Hungary, Serbia, and half of Europe. He was in the middle of strangling the last Christian empire in the world into submission. And then Timur arrived. Let's set the scene. By 1402, the Ottoman Empire was one of the great powers of the world. Bayezid I had been hammering at Constantinople, the last remnant of the ancient Roman Empire, now called the Byzantine Empire, for years. He was close. The city was exhausted, its territory reduced to basically just the city itself. A few more years, and it would fall to the Ottomans. Bayezid had also been making moves into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, absorbing smaller Turkish principalities. Some of their displaced princes had fled to Timur and asked for his help. Timur, who considered Anatolia part of the broader Mongol successor world he was reassembling, sent diplomatic demands to Bayezid, returned the displaced princes' lands, acknowledged Timur's supremacy. Bayezid's response was not diplomatic. The chronicles record various insults, both ways. The two men exchanged letters of escalating arrogance and contempt. Each was clearly used to being the most powerful man in any conversation. And then Timur came west. The Battle of Ankara, July 20th, 1402, near the city of Ankara, in the heartland of what is now Turkey, the two armies met. Both were enormous. Contemporary accounts suggest combined forces of perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers, numbers that historians have debated, but that clearly reflected two of the largest military machines in the world. Timur had done something clever before the battle. Using his intelligence network, he had made contact with several commanders in the Ottoman army, particularly soldiers from the Anatolian principalities that Bayezid had absorbed. These men were not enthusiastic about fighting for the man who had conquered their homelands. Timur promised them restoration. At a critical moment in the battle, a significant part of Bayezid's army, the soldiers from those Anatolian principalities, switched sides. The Ottoman line broke. Bayezid fought on personally, rallying what forces he could. He was brave, he was defiant, and then he was surrounded. He was captured alive. The Sultan of the Ottomans, the Thunderbolt, prisoner of Timur. Now, you may have heard the legend of the iron cage, that after his capture, Bayezid was put in an iron cage and used as Timur's footstool when he mounted his horse. This is one of the most famous stories about Timur in European history. It appears in countless books, paintings, and plays, including a famous play by the English writer Christopher Marlowe. Here's the honest historical answer: probably not. The earliest sources, written closest to the events, don't mention the cage. It appears in later, more dramatic accounts, growing more elaborate over time. What the earlier sources say is that Bayezid was treated with a degree of respect appropriate to his status as a captured ruler, while still clearly being a captive. Bayezid died in captivity about 8 months after his capture, whether from illness, despair, or some combination. He was perhaps 50 years old. The consequences of Ankara were extraordinary, and one of them was almost accidental. With the Ottomans defeated and Bayezid's sons fighting each other over the succession, the Ottoman siege of Constantinople collapsed. The Byzantine Empire, the last flicker of Rome, which had been slowly dying for decades, got an unexpected reprieve. Constantinople would survive for 50 more years, finally falling to the Ottomans in 1453. Timur, by defeating Bayezid, accidentally bought the Byzantine Empire half a century of life. History is sometimes very strange. After Ankara, Timur returned to Samarkand. He was in his late 60s. He had conquered more territory than almost any ruler in history. He had wealth beyond counting. And yet, resting was apparently not in his nature, because now he was looking east, toward the largest, wealthiest, most powerful empire in the world, toward China. In December 1404, Timur set out eastward from Samarkand in the dead of winter. He was 68 years old. His body was failing him. The road ahead was thousands of miles through some of the harshest terrain on earth, and his destination was China. He would never arrive. Timur had spent his life making Genghis Khan his measuring stick. Genghis had conquered China. The Mongol Yuan dynasty had ruled China for a century. Now the Ming dynasty, an ethnic Chinese ruling house that had thrown out the Mongols in 1368, controlled the most populated and wealthiest empire on earth. Timur had been accepting tribute from the Ming dynasty for years. The Ming emperors sent him gifts and letters that diplomatically called him a vassal, a client state, which Timur found increasingly insulting. A man who had defeated the Golden Horde, conquered Persia, looted Delhi, captured the Ottoman Sultan, being called someone's vassal? He assembled an army, one of his largest, and in December 1404, at the age of 68, with his body already weakening, he marched east. The road east from Samarkand toward China runs through some of the most unforgiving landscapes on the planet. Across the dry steppes of Central Asia, through the mountain passes of the Tian Shan Range, into the vast desert borderlands before China proper begins. It was winter. The temperatures dropped far below freezing. Even Timur's experienced, hardened soldiers found it brutal, and Timur himself was not what he had been. He was old. His old arrow wounds ached. He had been on campaign for decades. Every great conqueror carries the accumulated damage of a life of war. The army reached Otrar, a city in what is now southern Kazakhstan, in January 1405. Timur was ill, seriously ill. What the illness was exactly, the chronicles don't record with medical precision. Fever, almost certainly. Perhaps a respiratory infection compounded by the brutal cold. Perhaps simply the accumulated weight of almost 70 years of extraordinary, relentless living finally landing on a body that had carried it too long. He did not leave Otrar. On February 18, 1405, the exact date varies slightly across sources, Timur died. He was 68 or 69 years old, depending on which birth date you accept. His body was preserved with camphor and rose water, wrapped carefully, placed in an ebony coffin, and carried back to Samarkand, back to his city, back to the mausoleum he had ordered built not long before. He was buried in the Gure Amir, tomb of the ruler, and the curse was placed on the stone above him. The road he was walking when he died had no end. There was always another horizon, another campaign, another empire to measure himself against. He spent 40 years restless, moving, building, and burning in equal measure. And in the end, the road simply ran out before he did. But Timur was wrong about one thing. He thought the great work he was building needed him to keep going. In fact, what happened after his death would prove that the fire he'd lit, the culture, the art, the learning, could burn for a very long time without him. Timur's sons fought each other for the throne. His grandsons continued the wars, and one of his grandsons, a quiet, brilliant young man who would rather look at the sky than conquer it, built the greatest astronomical observatory in the world, and was murdered by his own son for doing so. After Timur died, the succession was exactly as messy as you might expect. He had sons and grandsons by the dozen, and several of them had claims to rule. Within a few years, civil war broke out. The empire shrank. Regions in the Caucasus, the Middle East, and Persia broke away. The outer reaches of Timur's vast conquests simply stopped being governed from Samarkand. But two of Timur's successors created something remarkable in the wreckage. Shah Rukh, one of Timur's sons, eventually emerged as the dominant ruler, claiming control of Samarkand in 1409 and ruling until 1447. He was a very different kind of Timurid ruler, quieter, more interested in diplomacy than conquest, a serious patron of art and scholarship. Under Shah Rukh, the empire stabilized, if at a smaller size. Cities flourished, manuscripts were produced, artists found patronage. And Shah Rukh's son, Timur's grandson, was Ulugh Beg. His birth name was Muhammad Taragai, but history knows him as Ulugh Beg, which means great prince. He was born in 1394 and grew up in the glittering world of Samarkand, surrounded by scholars and artists and craftsmen gathered from across the known world by his extraordinary grandfather. He could have been a conqueror. Instead, he chose to be a scientist. Ulugh Beg was fascinated by astronomy, the study of the stars, planets, and the patterns of the sky. He built in Samarkand the largest astronomical observatory in the world at that time, a massive stone structure designed to precisely measure the positions and movements of stars and planets. It still exists in Samarkand today, partially excavated, with the curved channel of its main instrument, a sextant 60 meters long, cut into solid rock, still visible underground. With this observatory, Ulugh Beg produced astronomical tables, detailed catalogues of over 1,000 stars, with their positions calculated to a precision that would not be matched for another century. He measured the length of the year to within a few seconds of accuracy. He calculated the Earth's axial tilt, to within minutes of the value we know today. Ulugh Beg's star catalogue, produced in the 1420s and 1430s, was so accurate that when European astronomers in the 17th century were trying to verify their own measurements, they used his tables as a reference. A man in Samarkand 500 years ago, measuring the stars, and being trusted by scientists 200 years after his death. Ulugh Beg also established a madrasa, an Islamic school, in Samarkand that became one of the great centers of learning in the medieval world. At its height, it attracted scholars from across the Islamic world who came to study mathematics, astronomy, theology, and philosophy. The tragedy of Ulugh Beg is that this same grandson of Timur, this scientist, this scholar, this builder, was murdered in 1449 by his own son, Abd al-Latif, who wanted the throne. He was captured during a political crisis, deposed, and killed on his way to Mecca, where he had requested to be allowed to go as a pilgrim. He was 55 years old. His son ruled for only 6 months before being overthrown in turn. There is something deeply human about this story. Timur, the great conqueror, dreamed of military glory and a reunified Mongol empire. His grandson, raised in the civilization Timur's conquests funded, looked up at the sky and wanted to understand it. And the world he created, this Timurid Renaissance as historians call it, was in some ways more lasting, more genuinely extraordinary than any battlefield victory. Because while empires come and go, a star catalogue that measures 1,000 stars to within a minute of arc, that survives. The Timurid Empire itself, though, was running out of time. Enemies were gathering, and the bloodline of Timur, rather than dying out, was about to make one final extraordinary journey, not west or north, but south, into India, and from that journey something would be built that the world still visits today. He was 11 years old when his father died. He was kicked out of his homeland. He spent decades failing to reconquer what was his. And then he looked south and changed the world forever. His name was Babur, and his blood was Timur's blood. And what he built in India, his descendants would one day crown with the most beautiful building ever made. By the 1490s, the Timurid Empire was fragmenting fast. From the north, a new force was rising, the Uzbek Khanate, under a leader named Muhammad Shaybani Khan, a Chinggisid descendant who had every intention of taking the Timurid lands for himself. City by city, the Uzbeks absorbed Transoxiana. In 1501, they took Samarkand itself, the city that Timur had built into a jewel of the world, now belonging to someone else. Among the many people fleeing the Uzbek advance was an 11-year-old boy, the ruler of Fergana, a small Timurid principality in what is now eastern Uzbekistan. His father had just died, leaving him nominal ruler of a tiny state surrounded by enemies, with a handful of followers and very large ambitions. His birth name was Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad. He gave himself a nickname Babur. It means tiger. Babur spent the next 15 years of his life trying to reclaim Samarkand, the ancestral capital, the city of his great-great-grandfather Timur. He captured it 3 times, he lost it 3 times. The Uzbeks were simply too powerful. So Babur did what you do when one road is completely blocked. He looked for a different road. He looked south. In 1526, at the Battle of Panipat, a field north of Delhi, the same city that Timur had sacked 128 years earlier, Babur's smaller, better organized, artillery-equipped army defeated the much larger forces of the Delhi Sultanate. He took Delhi, he took Agra, he proclaimed himself Emperor of Hindustan. The Mughal Empire, Mughal being a Persian rendering of Mongol, was born. The Mughal Empire would go on to rule northern India and Pakistan for 300 years. At its height, under emperors like Akbar the Great and Shah Jahan, it controlled a realm with more than 150 million people, roughly a quarter of the world's entire population. It was one of the richest empires in history. And the art, the architecture, the culture it produced. The Red Fort in Agra, the Lahore Fort, the Jama Masjid Mosque in Delhi, the great gardens and cities and miniature paintings of the Mughal age, and above all, the Taj Mahal. Shah Jahan, the 5th Mughal emperor, a direct descendant of Babur, and therefore a direct descendant of Timur, built the Taj Mahal in the city of Agra between 1632 and 1653. He built it as a tomb for his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal, who died in childbirth. The Taj Mahal is considered by many people, architects, artists, travelers, ordinary people who've seen it, to be the most beautiful building ever made. Its white marble dome, its 4 minarets, its perfect symmetry reflected in the long pool before it, its inlaid precious stones in floral patterns, its verses from the Koran inscribed in black stone around every arch, and in its design and proportions, in the geometry of its domes and arches and gardens, you can see, if you look, the echo of Timur's Samarkand, the same tradition of Persian Mongol Turkic architecture, refined over 2 centuries, culminating in something the world had never seen. Think about this thread. Follow it like a river. An arrow strikes a young man's leg on a dark night in Central Asia. That young man, limping and stubborn and burning with ambition, builds an empire by force of will and violence and extraordinary intelligence. From his city, Samarkand, a tradition of art and architecture spreads. His descendants are expelled from their homeland. One of them looks south into India and starts again. And 130 years after that founding, one of his great-great-grandsons builds a white marble tomb for a woman he loves. From an arrow wound to the Taj Mahal, from Timur the Lame to Shah Jahan, from iron to marble. And now we need to go back to that sealed tomb in 1941. Because there's one more part of this story to tell, and it asks a question that doesn't have a simple answer. It asks, how do we decide what a life meant?